This morning we're continuing the message from last Sunday morning, so let me begin with a brief review. Peter and 6 of the other disciples went fishing together on the Sea of Galilee. This is sometime between 8 and 40 days after the resurrection of Jesus. It was a long, frustrating night of fishing in God's providence, and at dawn a stranger called from the shore and told them to try putting the net down on the other side. Now, that was a ridiculous thing to say because they'd been trying the other side all night long. But once more they tried and brought in a huge catch of fish. And when that happened, John realized that the stranger on the shore had to be the Lord. And when John told Peter that, Peter wanted nothing more than to be with Jesus as soon as he possibly could. And so for the second time in his life, Peter leaped from a boat to head to Jesus. And when he got there, Jesus had breakfast ready for those weary men and fed them. And we went back and we considered how Jesus had called these men to follow him in the first place, at the beginning. How, and then how at this point, after the resurrection, when they were struggling so much, he brought them back to the Sea of Galilee, back to the place of their original calling. And he cared for them and he fed them. And we learned that when Jesus calls us to come follow him, he turns the entire direction of our lives toward him and toward his people. Our life is submitted to him, and we fish for men, and we have higher purposes, what I'm calling a higher calling, to live for something greater than just ourselves. But we might be tempted to give up, to decide it's just too hard to try to follow Jesus and to try to live for higher things. But when we are tempted to head in that direction, Jesus will bring us back. He'll keep drawing us back. He might even leave us with some empty nets. He might even frustrate a whole night's worth of fishing. But he does that to bring us back to the things that are really worth living for, back to our higher calling. And so he is gracious to us. Come and eat breakfast, he said to them. And that gracious master is the one who calls of each of us to give our lives to him, to submit to him, to come follow his higher calling for us. Now we'll continue this morning in verse 15. What I want to do first is just talk through the text, the meaning of the text, and then talk about its application for us. So verse 15. So when they had finished breakfast, Jesus said to Simon Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" And he said to him, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." And Jesus said to him, "Tend my lambs." Now, what did Jesus mean when he asked here, "Do you love me more than these?" These what? Or who? Who is he talking about? And the answer really isn't given here. Remember last Sunday we noted that John 21 doesn't explain why the disciples went fishing. It leaves that open for you to ponder and to ask yourself the question, why might I have gone fishing in a similar situation? And so there's something similar here where we're left to ponder, what did Jesus mean? What really was going on in Peter's heart, and what was Jesus going after? So Jesus says, "Do you love me more than these?" And we might be able to come up with more than 2 possibilities for what he means, but I think some of the others are really poor. I think there are 2 good possibilities. One is he could mean, do you love me more than you love these fish? In other words, do you love me more than you love your job, your career, your financial security? You just went back to fishing. And again, we said last week, we don't know for sure what his motives were, but he could mean, are you going to stop following Jesus to go back to fish? Do you love me more than them? Do you love me more than that? Or the second thing Jesus could mean is, do you love me more than these other men love me? Because there were 6 other guys there, 6 other followers. So we're left to ponder that. And I lean kind of strongly toward the second answer for 2 reasons. First of all, Peter did not comment on whether he loved Jesus more. Jesus said, "Do you love me more?" And Peter didn't reply to that part of his question. Now, if Jesus meant, do you love me more than the fish? Surely Peter would have said something. I mean, if you were asked, do you love Jesus more than your job? What would you say? Wouldn't you quickly say, oh yes, Jesus, I love you more? But he doesn't say that. He just says, I love you. And so I really, really doubt that Jesus was asking, do you love me more than these fish, more than you love fishing, more than you love your job and your life, your way? The second reason why I think it's most likely that Jesus meant, do you love me more than these men love me, is because this is just what Peter had boasted about. He had boasted about his greater, deeper commitment to Jesus. When Jesus told the disciples they would all fall away on the night of his arrest, right there in front of the rest of those men, Peter said, even though all may fall away from you, I will never fall away. All right, so doesn't it seem to make a lot of sense that once Peter had been so deeply humbled that Jesus would come back and say, now, Peter, do you love me more than these other guys do? That's a hard question. But I think Peter answered it just the right way. He didn't even comment on the do I love you more. He didn't even go for the comparison at all. He was maybe done with some of that foolishness from his past. And he just says, Jesus, notice that. You know that I love you. He's not quite even willing to just say it for himself, just to say, I do love you. He just casts himself upon what Jesus knows, and he just says, Jesus, I really believe that you know that despite all my struggles and all my problems, deep down, Jesus, you know I really do love you. Yeah, I think it was a really good, humble answer from Peter. And so Peter then replies with a command, Jesus then replies with a command to Peter to get to work serving Jesus. At the end of verse 15, tend my lambs. So then verse 16, Jesus said to him again a second time, Simon, son of John, do you love me? And Peter said to him, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. And this time, Jesus doesn't ask about the comparison, just the straight question, do you love me? And again, Peter says, you know I do. And again, Jesus says, shepherd my sheep. Shepherd my sheep. Do you love me, Simon? You know that I do. Shepherd my sheep. Now, there's some variation in this passage with the Greek words. There are two different words for love. There are a couple different words for sheep and a couple different words for shepherding. And the older commentators used to really read into that a lot, and especially to say that Jesus and Peter were talking about two different kinds of love. And I'm not going to go into all of that right now, but I think there are some really, really good reasons to believe that's not the case. You've probably heard the agape versus philos love kind of discussion. That's really tricky, really tricky. It's partly tricky just because it's a strange thing that we don't really have in other things in the New Testament. In the New Testament, it seems like agape is used sometimes as a little bit stronger word than philos. But what's really weird about that is that's the opposite of the way it was used everywhere in Greek culture. In the Greek of that day, philos was undoubtedly the stronger word, and agape was the I like you kind of word. So why it seems like it's maybe a little bit different in the New Testament is really hard to know why. And philos, which is the word most people say is like a lesser kind of maybe just a friendship or something. Philos is used for God's love for you, your love for God, God's love for Jesus, and Jesus' love for God. Oh, I don't think we're talking about a, hey, I like you or you're my friend kind of a love there. So there are a lot of good reasons to think that the variation in words here is just synonyms being used for the sake of variety in what he's saying, rather than trying to read a meaning into that. So the flow of thought is, do you love me, Simon? You know that I do. Shepherd my sheep. 2 times in a row. Well, verse 17. He said to him the 3rd time, Simon, son of John, do you love me? Peter was grieved because it's the 3rd time. Peter was grieved because he said to him the 3rd time, do you love me? And he said to him, Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you. And Jesus said to him, "Tend my sheep." 3 times. 3 times. Why does Jesus ask the question 3 times? Well, I don't know, but there were 3 denials by Peter, and the final denial took place at that charcoal fire, just like this one. 3 times he denied Jesus. 3 times he humbly confesses his love for Jesus. 3 times Jesus urges him to get back to his higher calling and shepherd the sheep who belong to Jesus. Now, it's very important that we not insert a break between verses 17 and 18, but instead keep reading all the way to the middle of verse 19. So go back to verse 17 with me. He said to him the 3rd time, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" Peter was grieved because he said to him the 3rd time, "Do you love me?" And he said to him, "Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you." Jesus said to him, "Tend my sheep. Truly, truly, I say to you, when you were younger, you used to gird yourself and walk wherever you wished. You had freedom. But when you grow old, you will stretch out your hands, and someone else will gird you and bring you where you do not wish to go." Now this he said, signifying by what kind of death Peter would glorify God. Whew. There's a fairly strong tradition in the early church that Peter died by crucifixion. Even the possibility that Peter requested to be crucified upside down, possibly because he didn't feel worthy to die just like Jesus did. And this phrase in verse 18, "stretch out your hands," was used at times for crucifixion. So it seems that Jesus is saying here, Peter, if you love me, tend my sheep, and I'm telling you that your path's going to be very hard as you get older. You are going to lose your freedoms as you get older, and you're going to end up dying for me. And maybe he's even saying you're going to end up crucified. Then read the end of verse 19. And when he had spoken this, he said to him, "Follow me." Do you feel the weight of that? Peter, follow me. Now, apparently at this point, Jesus and Peter had actually risen from breakfast and were actually walking together along the shore of the Sea of Galilee. And Peter looked back and he saw that John was following them. And so look with me at verse 20. Peter, turning around, saw the disciple whom Jesus loved following them, the one who also had leaned back on his bosom at the supper and said, "Lord, who is the one who betrays you?" So we're talking about John here, right? So Peter, seeing him, said to Jesus, "Lord, and what about this man?" Jesus said to Peter, "If I want John to remain until I come, what is that to you? You follow me." Do you feel the weight again? Peter, if you love me, tend my sheep, and truly your path will be very hard, and you're going to have your freedoms taken away, and you're going to end up crucified. Now come follow me. Well, what about John? His path, his future is not for you to worry about, Peter. Not for you to compare. You come follow me. Peter, will you commit your life to follow Jesus no matter what? Do you love him? And to each of us, it's the same question. Will you commit your life to follow Jesus no matter what? Do you love him? The final verses in the chapter give us some glimpses into the first century setting behind this gospel. First of all, in verse 23, John wants to give you a clarification. Look at verse 23. Therefore, this saying went out among the brethren that the disciple would not die. Yet Jesus did not say to him that he would not die, but only, if I want him to remain until I come, what is that to you? Who's writing that? John. He's talking about himself. He's saying, now I've heard that people are saying that I'm going to live until Jesus comes again. That's not what Jesus said. He just told Peter, it's not your business. So John there kind of speaks to us and says, don't misunderstand that. That's not what he meant. Then in verse 24, we hear from somebody else, not John. Other Christians maybe who were with him, maybe in his older age, maybe they helped John with the writing of this gospel. We don't know, but look at verse 24. They write this. This is the disciple who is testifying to these things and wrote these things, and we know that his testimony is true. That's a pretty remarkable verse. That's a pretty cool verse. It's like you can imagine them saying to John, hey, John, can we just stick a note right there? That we're with you and we know you and you wrote this? And they should trust your testimony because you were there. And then finally, verse 25, a joyful hyperbole. And there are also many other things which Jesus did, which if they were written in detail, John says, I think the world itself couldn't contain the books that would be written. You know what that is? That's just happy John. That's John who loves Jesus. Just saying, I tell you what, I've written some stuff for you here in the gospel, but if we tried to write every amazing thing Jesus did, I don't even think the whole world could contain the books. That's joyful hyperbole. That's happy John. You can't plumb the depths of Jesus' greatness and glory. You think you know some about how great Jesus is? You're just barely getting started. All right, what do those things mean for us? We made it through the text. As we said earlier, it's a passage that invites us to think through what these things mean and what Jesus might have said to us if we were there. So we start with the question, do you love me more? Do you love me? Do you love me more than others? But just, do you love me? And that reminds us that nothing's more important than our love for God. It's the first and it's the greatest commandment. Is God important to you? Is there a special commitment in your heart to him? Is he valuable? Is he a priority? Is he enjoyable? Is he a comfort? Is he a friend? Do you want to know him more? Do you have a desire to please him? Do you love God? Don't hyper-spiritualize what it means to love God. It's okay to take, I know we talk a lot about what true love is, but it's okay to take a word like love and think about what we mean by that in human relationships and ask yourself the question, is that how I feel about God? Like people you love, you want to be with. Do you want to be with him? People you love, you want to learn more about. Do you want to learn more about him? People you love are really important to you. Is he really important to you? You see? Do you love God? It's foundational for everything else. It's the essential spiritual attribute. And when Peter humbly repeated his assertion that he did love Jesus, Jesus responded by calling Peter right back to his higher calling. Peter's life was supposed to be about more than fishing, and so is yours. If you love Jesus, you will continue to commit your life to follow him and his path for you. In our last service, Clay used the phrase, it needs maintenance every day. Our commitment to follow Jesus needs maintenance every day. You will continue to commit your life to follow him. His path for you is a path of service to others. It's a path of making disciples of Jesus. It's a path of loving his people. Jesus said to Peter, shepherd my sheep. And I know there's a sense in which that was uniquely for Peter. And did you see in 1 Peter 5, he says, I'm just one of all the elders. Not I'm the Pope, but he's just one of all the elders called to shepherd the flock of God. And so in that sense, there was a particular meaning for Peter, for elders or pastors who are called to shepherd God's flock. But when Jesus says, shepherd my sheep, he's really saying something that's a call that applies to all of us. It's really not that different from the call to be fishers of men. Who are Jesus' sheep? Well, Jesus used that in two ways. He used it for the people who were already following him, and he used it for the people whom he was going to save, who were going to follow him. Other sheep I have who are not of this fold, them also I must bring. So who are Jesus' sheep? It's the people who are following him and the people whom he's going to save and are going to follow him. So be fishers of men, shepherd his sheep. That's all just saying live for Jesus' mission and live for Jesus' people. Go make disciples of Jesus. Go proclaim his excellencies. So how are you helping other people, whether they're followers of Jesus or not? How are you helping them learn about him and follow him? If your life is not oriented towards serving others, you've drifted away from what Jesus really called you to do. You've wandered off your path that he put you on. Maybe you started to go back to fishing, to just go back to the stuff of this life. That's like default for all of us. Default is just back to the stuff of life. Maybe, as Jesus said to Peter earlier, you are not setting your mind on God's interests, but man's interests. Now, is that a big deal? Well, I know it was a unique moment with Peter, but what did Jesus say to Peter in that setting? Anybody remember? What did Jesus say right before he said, "You're setting your mind on man's interests, not God's"? Get behind me, Satan. Oh! It is not a game. It is not a joke for me to just drift back to, I'm just going to live for me and the stuff of this life and not worry about Jesus. I'm saved. Jesus didn't call you to go pick up a ticket to heaven and stick it in your pocket and go back to the same old life. He called you to come follow him. Maybe we've grown weary in our service to others. Maybe your service to others has involved changing so many diapers that you wonder if you can handle another one. And you tried to get your husband to, and he said, no, he's not handling anymore either. Or maybe your serving for Jesus involves caring for an elderly parent, and it keeps going and going. Or maybe your service for Jesus involves a lot of really difficult people whom God has put into your life, and it is tiring. And the words of Jesus can remind us that it is a deep love for Jesus that will keep us going. If you've ever tried to serve people, you know what it's like to get worn out and just feel like, I can't keep doing it. I can't keep handling these problems. I have this. I hope I don't scare you when I say things like this. I fear that I do, but I also just I want you to know I'm real. I sometimes think, why do I have to be the person to whom everybody brings their problems? Why? And you know what God has to do in my heart when I say that, which is ridiculous for me to say, by the way. It's ridiculous. It says, Tim, first of all, you bring all your problems to God, right? You expect him to be there. You expect him to be a shepherd for you. Now, God called you to be an under shepherd. And what do you expect that's going to look like? If you bring all your problems to the chief shepherd and God called you to be an under shepherd, then what are people supposed to do? They're supposed to come bring their problems to you. And Tim, that's your greatest privilege. That is your greatest privilege. But folks, that's not just for pastors. It is your greatest privilege to get to serve people. To get to serve somebody whom Jesus redeemed with his precious blood and bought to himself, and you get to serve them. Okay, so they're frustrating. Join the frustrating people club, because we're all frustrating, okay? They're frustrating. Maybe you've got a friend who's been on the edge of crisis, and man, it just keeps going and going and going. And you're like, how long can I keep doing this? It's your privilege. When has Jesus been with you on the edge of crisis and kept going and going? You know? So I think those things, I feel those things sometimes, but it's really, it's honest, it's real, but it's foolish. And underneath all that, what is it that keeps you going? Love for Jesus. It's really not hard. You come back to, do I love Jesus? Yeah, I do. Is it a privilege to get to serve him? Of course. Come on, get up. Let's go. Deep love for Jesus is the spark that will keep the flames of loving service to people burning in your heart when it's pouring rain. It'll keep it burning. All right? If you love Jesus, you will continue to commit your life to follow him and his path for you. That path is focused on his sheep. It's a path of service to other people, but it's also a path of suffering. Peter was going to glorify God by his death, a martyr's death, and maybe even death by crucifixion. And he got told that in advance. Yikes. Consider how powerful this was for Peter, because Peter had said, I'll die with you, Jesus. I'll die for you. Why can't I go die for you? And then, when Jesus headed toward the cross, do you remember that it's Peter who tried to stop him? who tried to tell him, God forbid that you die. That's when Jesus said, get behind me, Satan. Right? So Peter says, I'm going to die for you. I'm going to die with you. And then Peter says, no, you're not going to die on a cross. We're not going to let that happen. And then when it comes right down to it, what does Peter do? He denies that he even knows him. So much for dying with him. You won't even be known associated with him. So now Jesus brings Peter back. Can you see how powerful that is? Peter, do you love me? Will you follow me? Now, Peter, what if I tell you the end of your path is going to be the same kind of crucifixion you told me I could never do? What if I tell you you're going to head toward the same kind of death I died, the kind of death that you copped out on, and you denied you even knew me? You know, it sounds light to say it, but it's kind of like, Peter, let's try this again. Will you follow Jesus on a path of suffering? And if you want to know Peter's answer, you can go read 1 Peter and read all about what Peter said about the privilege of suffering with Christ. I'm going to use some of that in a couple minutes here, but he counted it a privilege. He counted it a joy to walk a path of suffering with Jesus. So what about us? You know, like Peter, when life is hard, what we're tempted to say is, what about that guy? Why'd he get called to the easy path? What? Why doesn't he have the troubles I have? Why is it so easy for her to follow Jesus and so hard for me? Why is her family so supportive and mine so hostile? Why'd he have an opportunity for such a great education and I never did? Why'd she get all the skills and I can't seem to do anything right? Why'd he get married and I didn't? Why does she have money and I don't? Why does he get all the good jobs and I can't seem to get anything? Why is my path always so hard and it seems like theirs is always so easy? Now, I know none of us would just say it that blatantly, but we do struggle with thinking that. And Peter would say, do you love Jesus? Will you trust his path for you? It's not about their path. Their path's got their own suffering and their own loss and their own fiery ordeals. And if it's not happening right now in their life, rejoice with those who rejoice, because it's coming. We read this verse in our scripture reading. Those who suffer according to the will of God shall entrust their souls to a faithful Creator in doing what is right. That's Peter, getting closer and closer to his death by martyrdom, saying, hey, put your life in his hands. He always does it right. Don't compare your path to others. Your path is from Jesus' hand. And it's a path for God's glory. You see that in verse 19? Now this Jesus said, signifying by what kind of death Peter would glorify God. And when John wrote that, it's almost certain that Peter had already died. John's dear friend Peter had been crucified at the hands of a cruel Roman emperor. And what John wants you to know about it is that he glorified God. Isn't that cool? You're thinking, Pastor Tim, I don't know if I'm going to say that death by crucifixion is cool. I agree. But John says, you see, that's what Jesus planned for him to glorify God. And Peter even rejoiced in it. John doesn't look at Peter's death and say the kind of thing we hear so often about suffering today. How could God ever allow it? Why do the bad people live without trouble and good people die terrible deaths? No, John says, look at how Peter glorified God. Look, Peter got to follow Jesus all the way to crucifixion. And this morning, can we each embrace the path on which God has placed us? With each distressing affliction and fiery trial, can we say, dear Jesus, this is your path for me. I'm not going to compare to others. I love you. Thank you for bringing me into the fellowship of the sufferings of Jesus, and I just want to glorify you on that path, no matter what lies ahead. And Jesus is going to shepherd us all the way along that path. You know, when I look at John 21, you know what I see in John 21? I see Jesus, the great shepherd and guardian of our souls, shepherding. He showed up that morning to shepherd, and he did a great job of it. Jesus is going to shepherd us even through our failures. 3 times Peter denied Jesus, climaxing at the charcoal fire in the courtyard of Annas. 3 times Jesus leads Peter to affirm his love for Jesus at this charcoal fire back at the Sea of Galilee where he'd been called. You know, I wonder if there's even a little bit of meaning in the word Simon. You know what Jesus says here? He just calls him Simon, Simon, Simon. Now, he called him Simon other times, so I'm not certain, but it could be that he's using just that name to remind you, Peter, you remember the Simon from before? You remember the one whom I came and called? Now you're back at the same place, and you just went back to fishing. And so let me ask you a question, Simon. Do you love me? Do you love me more than these? And what does he say to him? Follow me. That's the same thing. That's the same thing from 3 years ago at the shore of the Sea of Galilee. Peter, follow me. 3 years later, struggling, confused Peter, having failed, having been so humbled. Come on, Peter, follow me. And in verse 22 again, you follow me. Come back to your higher calling. Simon, are you going to go back to the old life? No, come on, come follow me. If you love Jesus, you'll continue to commit your life to follow him and his path for you. So now, I tried to imagine, I went and read through 1 Peter, and I tried to imagine what Peter might say to us if we talked to him about some of our own struggles with following Jesus. And we don't have to imagine because we got Peter's words here in the New Testament, right? So I'm not suggesting we start praying to saints or something like that. I'm talking about what Peter wrote here. So we might say to him, Peter, I'm trying to follow Jesus, but I'm struggling. And no insult meant, but Peter, you seem like the kind of guy who might understand somebody who's struggling to follow Jesus. So I got a couple questions. I'm trying to follow Jesus, but Peter, I'm just so weak. What would Peter say? Well, he might say, join the club. Can I tell you a story about the Garden of Gethsemane and what I did there? That's when Jesus taught us the spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak. So join the weak club, but you are protected by the power of God, and Jesus is the shepherd and guardian of your soul. So yeah, you're weak, but you're not weak in him. Okay, Peter, I'm trying to follow Jesus, but I am worn out, and it seems like everything goes wrong. And Peter might say, I'm sorry, it hurts, but it's going to be worth it. You've got an imperishable inheritance waiting for you. Praise, glory, and honor. You just fix your hope completely on when Jesus comes again. You might say, okay, Peter, I'm trying to follow Jesus, but the temptation to go back to the world is fierce for me. I don't know why everybody else doesn't seem to struggle with it like I struggle with it, but I mean, for me, it's crazy. I just want to go back and live for those things, have those pleasures, do what I want to do. And I think Peter would say, oh, listen, you got to be on the alert because the devil is always prowling around seeking whom he can devour. And that's what's going on. It's not really that the world's that good. It's that the devil wants to devour. And so you realize those lusts, they wage war against your soul. You got a holy calling. You were bought with a precious price. You belong to God. You say, okay, Peter, I'm trying to follow Jesus, but I'm doubting. And I hate to admit it, but I'm doubting. And Peter might say, hey, I know about doubting. I doubted myself many times, including on Resurrection Sunday, until Jesus came to me. Do you know about my friend Thomas? He's a good example for all of us when we're doubting. But I can tell you this. I saw the risen Jesus. I talked to him. I heard him. I ate with him. I touched him. And I tell you, he's the precious cornerstone for those who believe. Listen, your faith, in a sense, is more valuable than mine because I saw him, touched him, heard him, and I believed. You heard the testimony about him and you believed. His precious value is for you because of your faith. Yeah, your faith's struggling. He's not looking for the amount of your faith. He just wants the genuineness of it. You say, Peter, I'm trying to follow Jesus, but I'm fearful of what lies ahead. And Peter says, yeah, we faced the hostility of the Jewish leadership and the hostility of the Roman Empire. You think you got struggles with religious freedom? You should have tried Rome. And Jesus told me the end of my life was going to be hard and I was going to die a martyr's death. So I know what it's like to fear what's coming next. But have you tasted the kindness of the Lord? That's a great little line Peter uses. Have you tasted the kindness of the Lord? And if you have, then cast all your anxiety on him because he cares for you. Peter, I'm trying to follow Jesus, and I'm trying to be a fisher of men, and I'm trying to shepherd the sheep, but fish stink and sheep stink. People are hard. And Peter says, yep, you stink and I stink. People are hard. But here's the thing. Here's another line Peter uses. In the context of love for people, he says, you were called for this very purpose, that you might inherit a blessing. I think, what does he mean by that? And I'm not sure, but probably part of what he means is, if God called you, sheep like you, so that he might pour out his blessing on you, could you be a blessing to other people too? Because it's right there in that section of 1 Peter where he says, be sympathetic, be kind-hearted, be humble in spirit, and stay fervent in your love for one another. Peter, I'm trying to follow Jesus, but life just makes me feel hopeless. And I think Peter would say, I know I said this before, but I can give you eyewitness testimony to the resurrection of Jesus. And if Jesus lives, you have a living hope. And if Jesus lives, nothing is truly hopeless. 1 Peter 1, he goes right after hope and he connects it right to the resurrection. Peter, here's the big one. I'm trying to follow Jesus, but I failed, and I failed big time. What would Peter say to that? Peter would probably say, well, I know all about failure. I failed at the beginning, and Peter failed later, and the Bible tells us about it. Poor guy. You think your failures are public. 2,000 years later, we're still talking about Peter's. So Peter says, I know about failure. You know that I know about failure. I just encourage you to jump out of the boat. You remember that I did that a couple times? And I may not have always been the smartest guy, and I might have been a little impetuous and hasty, but I only jumped out of the boat because I knew I needed Jesus, and I wanted Jesus, and I just encourage you that that's what you need to do. You need to get to Jesus as fast as you can, because he's a kind and a tender shepherd, and he can restore you even when it seems like everything is lost, but you got to humble yourself and run or swim or wade or whatever you got to do to get to Jesus. You just got to go to Jesus and go now. If you've been staying away from Jesus because you failed, go to him. Jump out of the boat. Jump out of the boat and go. And finally, we might say to Peter, Peter, I'm trying to follow Jesus, but I'm distressed. It feels like wave after wave after wave of trials. And Peter says, go read my letter. That's what I wrote about. And he says, listen, I'm not trying to oversimplify the challenges you're facing, but the first thing you need to do is don't be surprised at the fiery ordeals that you go through. Christ suffered for you, and he left an example for you to follow in his steps. So keep on rejoicing even in the trials, because you draw so close to Jesus through those things. And Jesus told me, I'm gonna lose my freedom and die as a martyr, but my heart's full of rejoicing. Joy inexpressible, he says. And it's a privilege to walk the path of Jesus and glorify him. I don't care what they do to me. They can't take away what I have in Christ. And though each person's path is different, don't forget that the same experiences of suffering are being accomplished by your brethren who are in the world. See, that's the same thing as don't be surprised by the fiery ordeal. Yeah, John's path would be different. He would have his own distresses. He would have his own fiery ordeals. He would have his own suffering. Every believer does. So don't compare. Walk your path that God's called you to. And after you have suffered for a little while, the God of all grace, who called you to his eternal glory in Christ, will himself perfect, confirm, strengthen, and establish you. And so Peter finishes up by saying, to him be dominion forever and ever. Reign, King Jesus. So those are the kind of things Peter might say to us. Peter does say to us this morning. He does say those things. And so would he have any of those things to say to you? Is any of that for you right now?